Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay, but we are happy to have you here tonight for this wonderful event. My name is Mallory Howard, and I am the assistant curator at the Mark Twain House Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, and I am delighted that all of you are joining us. So tonight, we are welcoming Vaishnavi Patel and Sujata Srinivasan for a discussion of Vaishnavi's debut novel, Kaikeyi. I'll introduce our lovely guests more formally in just a minute, but first, a couple of things to go over. First and foremost, thanking our sponsors. So the Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy and honored to keep his memory alive with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all of our virtual programs. So big thank you to them. One of the benefits of this being a virtual program is that you as the audience can have your own conversation, which a lot of you are already doing in the chat, along with our guest discussion tonight. So we do encourage you to chat with one another as the program proceeds. We'll also be posting the link to purchase a signed copy of Kaikeyi from the Mark Twain store. So getting your copy through our store not only gets you a signed copy of the book, but it also helps to benefit and support the museum, which we very much appreciate. If you have a specific question for our speakers tonight, you will see a box at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. That would be the spot to post your questions in, and at the very end of the program, we will be able to take some of those audience questions. And then finally, near that Q&A, you will notice a long green bar. If you are enjoying the program this evening and would like to support the museum, you can click on that link to donate through our Birdies for Charity program, where your gift will grow 15% thanks to Webster Bank's support of the Bonus Bucks pool. So now that I have said all of that, let's get down to business. I'm going to formally introduce our guests for tonight. So Vaishnavi Patel is a law student focusing on constitutional law and civil rights. She likes to write at the intersection of Indian myth, feminism, and anti-colonialism. Her short stories can be found in The Dark and 87 Bedford's historical fantasy anthology, along with a forthcoming story in Helios Quarterly. Vaishnavi grew up in and around Chicago, and in her spare time enjoys activities that are almost stereotypically Midwestern: knitting, ice skating, drinking hot chocolate, and making hot dish. Sujata Srinivasan is editor, news, and senior producer for Where We Live at Connecticut Public Radio. She is the author of an audiobook titled Mark Twain for Kids. We obviously love that. And the American Biography series produced by Columbia River Entertainment. In her spare time, she enjoys holding literacy and art workshops for children, painting, bicycling with her family, and playing with her rescue dog, Panju Matai, which I love that name. So with that being said, please sit back and enjoy. Do not forget about the Ask a Question at the end of the program, so make sure you get those in. With that, we are going to welcome them on screen. Hello.
Hi, great to be here.
Welcome, ladies. Thanks for being here. So Sujata, I'm going to let you get started, and when you are ready for Q&A, just give me a shout and I'll come back on.
Thank you, Mallory. Hi,
Thanks.
everyone. Delighted to be here, and pleasure to have you all this evening. What a great book. First, congratulations on your law degree. You graduated just a few days ago.
Yes.
So that's exciting in constitutional law. And then you have this incredible book, of an old warrior queen with her beautiful jasmine traditional hairdo. Congratulations. So the Ramayana, dates back, established dating is between about 500 to 100 BCE. And the Ramayana is a Sanskrit epic, meaning Rama's journey, or ayana as in travels. See a Mark Twain quote there in the box. And there are 24,000 verses, about seven cantos, written by Valmiki, an ancient seer in Sanskrit, who was a highway robber, by the way, and who was transformed after meditating on Rama. So this is a spiritual work, the original work, and deeply devotional, mythological. It has layers of philosophic meaning, layers of metaphors, and it's deeply personal to people in the Indian subcontinent, to Hindus. Rama is a deity of a living religion, worshipped today at temples across India, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, with many different versions of the Ramayana. And around the 12th century BCE, another poet, male, both of them, like Valmiki, this was Kamba, who wrote the Ramayana in the Tamil language. So that's the setting of the epic. Unlike the other great epics of our world, the Iliad, the Odyssey, I mean, this is the journey of a god, a living god that's worshipped at altars and at temples. And, as another god, an avatar of Vishnu would later say, Pavitranaya sadhunam vinashaya ch dushkritam dharma samsthapanaya sambhavami yuge yuge. So I will come back again and again to set the world in order when it's off its axis, when its dharma disappears, and when the forces of darkness take over. So that is the historic setting. And the abstract divinity descended in human form of Rama, with the villains very clearly demarcated, Kaikeyi, your protagonist, and Ravana. And that is the context, the historical context. Now, I think I and us would love to hear you read a few words from perhaps your opening chapter, Vaishnavi, of your retelling.
Yes, I would love to. So I'm going to read, I don't like to give spoilers or anything, so I'm just going to read from the first few pages, basically the first scene of Kaikeyi. I was born on the full moon under an auspicious constellation, the holiest of positions. Much good it did me. In Bharat, where the gods regularly responded to prayers and meddled in mortal affairs, the circumstances of my birth held great promise. This did not matter to my father, who cared only that my brother Yudhajit followed me into the world minutes later under the same lucky stars. Regardless of birth position, Yudhajit, being a boy, was the heir to the Kekaya kingdom. I was but a dowry of 50 fine horses waiting to happen. For each of my mother's subsequent pregnancies, my father made sacrifices to the gods, requesting sons. In return, he was blessed with 6 more healthy boys, portents of future prosperity. The people of Bharat have often blamed my father for my sins, as if a woman cannot own her actions. He was not a perfect man, that I freely admit, but for all his faults, he loved each of his sons fiercely, playing with them in his throne room, bringing them the finest tutors in all the kingdom, and gifting them ponies so they would grow into brilliant cavalrymen. If he bears any fault for my actions, it is through his inaction. I remember few occasions when we exchanged words, and fewer still when he sought to speak with me, save one. My brothers and I were playing hide and catch in the sweeping field behind the palace, and it was my turn to find them. I kept my eyes shut as their laughter faded into wind, opening them only after counting to 20. I immediately saw a glimmer of movement by the stables. I crept slowly toward whichever brother was hiding there, knowing that they would get more nervous by the second, and planning how best to catch them. I doubted it was Mohan, who was 3 years younger than me. He was short and slow and knew I could easily grab him. Shantanu was a bit older and was fast as a deer, but I could try to trap him by chasing him toward the palace wall. If it was Yudhajit, he would be almost impossible to catch, though maybe... Shantanu stumbled out from behind the stable. With a whoop, I began sprinting toward him, my blood racing through my veins. But as I followed him past the side of the building, I stopped short. Had I just seen movement? I whirled around to find Yudhajit pressed against the wood, and my face split into a wild grin. He must have shoved Shantanu out of their mutual hiding spot to distract me. I spun, chasing Yudhajit around the stable, knowing as I did that I could never beat him in an outright foot race. He rounded the corner out of sight, and from just beyond the wall came a strangled shout. A second later, my shin collided with bony flesh, and I fell onto a tangled heap of bodies, Yudhajit right below me. I got you, I shouted breathlessly. Someone, probably Shantanu, groaned. I rolled off the pile and onto the hard ground, laughing, asking if they knew where Mohan was, when I saw legs coming toward me. I sat up, squinting at the guard, aware my white kurta was smeared liberally with dirt and grass, and my hair was falling from its braids, but only half embarrassed. Yudhajit, get up, I hissed. You two, the guard said, nodding his chin toward the group of us. The Raja would like to speak with you immediately. I rose to my feet. We can play later, I said to my brothers. You two go, I'll find Mohan. I had started to walk away when the guard called. Yuvradni Kaikeyi, the Raja wants you now. I turned to look at Yudhajit, shocked. He only shrugged at me. We trailed behind the guard back to the palace, and each of my steps felt heavier than the last. Something had to be amiss for my father to summon me. But if I had done something to anger him, why would he want Yudhajit too? As we approached the throne room, I dragged my feet against the stone, letting the guard and Yudhajit get further and further ahead. At the end of the hall, the guard turned and glared, waiting by the closed door until I reached him, then swinging it open in a precise movement. Yudhajit went in first, and I lingered a few seconds longer before following him into the flickering light of the hall. He half turned his head as I approached, and the light cast strange shadows on his wide forehead and narrow nose. His dark brown eyes held a flicker of apprehension, and his lips were pressed into a thin line, in what I was sure was an eerie rendering of my own face. I took my place a pace behind him and glanced surreptitiously around the room, afraid of attracting attention. During feasts, the high-ceilinged room was filled with rows of tables and throngs of people, and its cavernous depths did not seem large at all. Absent these preparations, the wooden pillars cast long shadows, the carvings of bulls and snakes and long-plumed birds that so entertained my younger brothers, fading into the gloom. The huge, crackling fire pits built partially to warm the entire hall when the weather turned in the winter, and partially, I suspected, to intimidate visitors, made me feel even smaller than I usually did. My father's throne was carved out of dark wood into stark, undecorated lines, much like the man who sat upon it. One hand stroked his beard, and he stared unwaveringly into the nearest pit, his thick eyebrows deeply furrowed. Despite the warmth of the flames, goose flesh crawled up my skin, and I tried not to shiver. After several minutes, Yudhajit, with all the patience of a 12-year-old boy, blurted out, "Why did you call us here if you wanted to sit and say nothing?" Raja Ashwapati looked up at him as if he had not realized we were there. He did not spare so much as a glance for me, hidden behind my brother. "Your mother," he began. I glanced around the room looking for her, but she was nowhere to be found. She would not have added much warmth to the room, but she was rarely cold the way father was. Father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, then said, "Your mother had to leave. She will not return." At that, Yudhajit laughed, and I winced. I wished we had learned this news from the guards without father present, so I could tell him it was not a prank. Had he not seen how distant our parents were toward each other, how quick to snap they were, how the edges of their relationship were fraying? But my brother, the brilliant heir, said, "We're too old for you to joke with us this way, father. Mother is Radni. A queen wouldn't just leave." "Kekaya is no longer Radni," father said, and his eyes sought me out for the first time. "Why, what?" Yudhajit's shoulders drooped. "Who will—" He trailed off, apparently unable to describe what our mother actually did. Our father sighed. "As the Yuvradni, Kaikeyi will slowly assume some of the duties of the queenship until you are old enough to wed." I bit down on my tongue, the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, and I swallowed before I could stain my teeth. I had no idea how to take on any of my mother's responsibilities, nor did I have any desire to. Yudhajit took my hand and squeezed it. "Surely mother will come back," he said. "She would not just leave us like that." The Raja shook his head. "She told me she would never return. Kekaya is no longer welcome here. And just like that, we were dismissed.
Thank you for that. And this is what the Washington Post has to say. A powerful feminist retelling of the epic, Patel resets the balance of power, creating an unforgettable heroine who understands that it isn't necessarily kings or gods who change history. What drew you to Kaikeyi, the probably the most vilified person in Indian mythology, Hindu mythology?
Yeah, so growing up, my grandma used to tell us stories from the Ramayana. Every summer, she would come visit us and she would tell us piece by piece the Ramayana. And we would ask for those stories again and again because it's such a great tale. And, we were a Hindu family, so it also just meant a lot to us. We were praying to these gods. It was a big cultural thing for us. And one day, I can't remember why, my mom was home when my grandma was telling the story. And she was telling about how Kaikeyi forced Ram into exile and how she was jealous and being influenced by her maid. And my mom jumps in and she says something like, well, without Kaikeyi, there would be no Ramayana. Ram would have just stayed in Ayodhya and he would never have gone and defeated Ravan. So if you think about it that way, Kaikeyi is actually the reason that all the good in the Ramayana happens. And that, as a 8 or 9-year-old, blew my mind because I had never thought about how she was actually necessary in some ways for Ram to go on this journey. So that sort of stuck with me because it was so shocking and startling for years and years. And over time, I started finding myself wanting to research Kaikeyi and learn more about her and learn who she was, because the other thing I knew about Kaikeyi was that she was a warrior of some sort, because that's how she gets the boons that give her the power to exile Ram. And so the more I learned about her, the more interested I became in her. And eventually I was like, wouldn't it be really interesting to write her story from her perspective, where she is the hero and or at least, she thinks she's the hero, and what would she have to say in that situation? And then the story kind of grew from there to be much more than that. But that was the origin of the story.
Wonderful. What were the sources of your learning more about Kaikeyi?
So, I read over many years Valmiki's Ramayana, because as you mentioned, it is that tons of thousands of verses long. And in there's little details. There's in one line, he sort of offhandedly mentions that Kaikeyi's bride price is that her son will be heir, which forms an important plot point in Kaikeyi and was actually taken from Valmiki's Ramayana. But I never heard that in any of the comics or abridged versions or, TV or adaptations that I saw, but that was there. So I did read that. And then after that, I was like, I want to read a lot of scholarship about this. And it was in the matter of reading about Kaikeyi and scholarship that I learned that I knew that there were a few versions of the Ramayana, because, I'd tell one version to my friends, they'd be like, actually, it didn't happen that way. So I assumed that there were some minor differences among households. But I learned that there were actually several even ancient versions of the Ramayana, and that as it spread across South and Southeast Asia with Hinduism, it took on a new life and a new form, to the point where, there's versions of the Ramayana that are told in, say, Thailand today that don't bear any resemblance to the Ramayana I grew up hearing, but is very much their Ramayana that is very important to them and a cultural touchstone. And so as I sort of expanded the frame to include all of these other versions, I started seeing all of these different pieces. They're minority retellings, but there are retellings where Lakshman is the one who kills Ravan, which is such an interesting point, and Ram is sort of like a background character, or considered more flawed. There's versions where Ravan is Sita's father, which is a theme that I take up in this book. There's just so many variations out there. So I started I didn't read like the full 24,000 verse versions of these others, because at that point I would still be reading today. But I found those translations, and I at least read the relevant parts about Kaikeyi, as well as other snippets and articles synthesizing them. So I have this whole folder on my computer that's called Kaikeyi Research. That's like getting to be too big at this point, but I love research. And so it was a really fun process for me.
And just as your Kaikeyi is turned up, you've turned the mythology on its head with your interpretation, powerful interpretation. And I see the connection, between your passion in constitutional law and the way you set the stage of governance in Rama's father's kingdom from the perspective of a woman. It's the telling, of not just Kaikeyi, but a woman in the marketplace, a woman trying to sell something, a woman having a conversation with her husband, trying to feed a child. And it's these women that are also somehow invisible in male versions of the Ramayana, or if they are visible, we do not get the nuances of their stories. So how did you approach Kaikeyi? What is, from a feminist perspective, from a constitutional law perspective, who is Kaikeyi to you?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think, building up these governance structures was a lot of fun, because I actually drew a lot from ancient Indian governance, or at least what they called ideal governance in like the Arthashastra, for like the structure of the inner council and the outer council. So it was a lot of fun to build that up, but then there's not that much written about what women were necessarily doing in these governments, right? Like it's sort of assumed in the genders of these words, because a lot of the words in Sanskrit are gendered, that these are male occupied positions. And so coming up with alternative structures, potentially more egalitarian structures, or just even different structures in Kaikeyi, was really interesting to me. And I did end up drawing on, some of my background. I do a lot of gender rights work. And, when you look at successful movements, they're almost never like great individual led movements. Like there are big individuals at the forefront, but the only reason that they have power is because they have recognized the power of all of the others in their group, and everyone else in their group has recognized their collective power. And so in integrating women from the marketplace and women from all walks of life into this narrative, it was important to me to include that, because I don't think that they could have gotten that same semblance of power if it had just been a very top heavy, no other involvement kind of group. Not to get like too nerdy into this, but I was thinking about that a lot there.
Yeah, that's evident through the book. One of the traditional teachings, and not too many generations ago, in fact, in my mother's generation, was Nanam, Acham, Madamai, Payirpu. These are 4 virtues taught to an Indian woman, an Indian girl child, by a mother in Tamil Nadu, South India. It was my mother who taught me. Nanam, shy, be shy. And my mother was not happy, with what she thought I was, very bold like a man. Acham, be afraid. I've never seen fear in you. Or if you're afraid, you're like a man. You think like a man. You were outspoken like a man. You are you don't hold back. You have ambition. Madamai, pretend to be a stupid, so your husband is not threatened. And Payirpu, which is so complicated, we shouldn't get into that here. So, but Madamai, and the theme of Madamai is there in your version of Kaikeyi, that she has many instances where she steps back. First, she's forced to not accept credit. in many scenes in her childhood, where she has saved the regiment, the camp, from enemy forces. She doesn't take credit, and not to give away your plot spoilers. Even down, she steps back. But I mean, she's an opinionated woman, who knows when to be visible, and she eventually gains power in her own way, and that's her trajectory. But some quotes stood out, some conversations. Yujit looks at his sister and goes, "You wrestle in the dirt, you like weapons and fast horses. I'd say you're more man than woman." And Kaikeyi says, his words hurt more than I could tell him. And Yudhishthir says, "It's a compliment. Who wants to be a woman?" And that theme over and over again. And there's a very powerful story in one scene that she receives from her mother. And she says, "If a woman crafted by the gods themselves could be consigned to this fate, what hope was there for a woman born of a woman?" And I'm talking about Ahalya, a story of another famous woman in Indian mythology. And so there you weave these tales of women in and out of your narrative. And Kaikeyi's voice, through her telling, through her experiences, through these conversations and dialogues and setting of the scene, from a villain, one begins to empathize perhaps at some point with her. But the opposite happens for the hero. What goes on there?
Yeah, so I mean, with Kaikeyi, I think it's a hard balance, and I think this answer might inadvertently answer one of the questions I see in the chat, which is we're getting the story from the perspective of Kaikeyi, and I think she is an extremely self-righteous character in that she does believe herself to be right, and in many ways it's very much shaped by her experiences where she is right, and she, as you say, has to step back and be demure or give up the credit, where she has learned to, like, if she doesn't have this self-belief, then nobody is going to have this self-belief in her. And, that was important to me to portray, but I think in the story as well, like, she is also justifying actions that are maybe less justifiable. And then when you get the view of the hero, I mean, she believes that she has to exile him, and you don't necessarily get his side of the story. I don't know. I don't want to get into spoilers, but I mean, I believe that both of them are right and both of them are wrong, personally. But writing the story from her eyes, she's a very black and white person. But when it comes to the patriarchy in the story, which I think is more broadly what you're asking, would stop me if it's not. I think that part of what I wanted to show is that it is, as you were saying, it's passed down. It's part of like family tradition. It's part of what is said to you by your family and by your teachers. And it's really hard to get rid of. It's insidious in many ways. I like to think that I grew up in a very progressive household when it came to gender. I mean, we didn't talk about feminism explicitly, but my mom kind of broke the chain of, telling us to be quiet and demure. And yet somehow I got those messages anyways. And even though I'm very much not, I felt as a kid some sort of shame about not being that way, or feeling like, I should have been born a boy, or life would be so much better if that had been the case, or I'm like not being like how I'm supposed to be, acting in terms of being quiet and in the background. And so I think that part of what I wanted to show is how even if, you're one person who doesn't believe in that, or you're one family that doesn't believe in that, the messages still come. They still come from outside. They still come from what we can't unlearn, or we struggle to unlearn. And that is really insidious. And it's also very human. And so when, for example, the story of Ahilya, which is part of the Ramayana and a very religious story, bothered me from a very young age. That, yes, ultimately she is, so a crash course in the story of Ahilya, for those who are not familiar, Ahilya is the wife of a very powerful sage. One of the gods, Indra, sort of covets her. He tricks her into sleeping with him by taking on the form of her husband. And then when her husband finds out, he punishes Indra by changing his appearance, and he turns Ahilya to stone. And it always bothered me. Like, I could never get a satisfactory explanation for why Ahilya was turned to stone and why her sort of accepting that punishment was virtuous. Because in many ways, she is portrayed as one of the most virtuous women because of that. And so, you know, I think that there are these little things baked into our stories, even with righteous and good characters, that are teaching us these lessons that it's harder to pinpoint and identify and unlearn.
And even today, I mean, did you grow up with the ritual oil bath? You know, when as a young child, did your mother take ducks, oil and keep ducks in your hand? So oil bath is a way for a mother or parent to bond with a child, usually the caregiver being the mother in a patriarchal society. And the mother, for a baby would give, rub oil on the child, massage the child. And then for a daughter alone, a Hindu mother would take drops of oil and go, Ahalya, Tara, Sita, Draupadi, Mandodari, Tata. Panchakanya smare nityam sarva papa vinashanam. As in, these are your role models for life. And that's Ahalya, a woman turned to stone. For what? Tara,
Exactly.
all of these women who did not exercise their voice, who were quiet, who really did not raise hell.
Yes. And I think that there is something admirable about Ahilya. There is something admirable about Mandodari, who is Ravan's wife. But it's not necessarily the fact that they had this grace and were able to bear this suffering with such strength is not, to me, something that like they as individuals are admirable, but as a society, I think
it's not the ideal.
It's not the ideal. Like, if, yeah, exactly. And it's saying something that society, rather than saying it was wrong what happened to these women, is saying these women are so virtuous for bearing what happened to them in this way.
You said it. And the Mantri Parishad, is better off, governance better off. I mean, life changes for the women in Ayodhya. Kaikeyi becomes the third wife of the king, who weds her to get a son. Basically an heir to the throne. And he did have a daughter, but she hardly appears in the Ramayana. Shanta, we don't. The story is a side story. But yes, the reason for this. So the childless state eventually, was solved by this king marrying over and over until he realized, probably, hey, wait a minute, maybe the gods are angry because I haven't prayed enough to them. And so the divine birth for Rama and his siblings. And there's a supernatural element in your book.
Yeah. So, I mean, in addition to the actual gods and demons, which to me is not necessarily a supernatural, or it's not a magical element, because to me it's a religious element. But there is an actual magical element that's not in the actual Ramayana, which Kaikeyi discovers pretty early, so I think it's fine to talk about. But it's called the binding plane, and she basically can see her relationships with others and other people's relationships with each other, and she has some amount of control to make suggestions or strengthen relationships or break relationships that she uses pretty liberally throughout the story. And it was so much fun to come up with it, but also to put it in this story in particular, because I think this story is so much about, free will versus fate. And as much as Kaikeyi is fighting to have her own free will and agency, something that she considers once or twice, but never really bats an eye at otherwise, is that she is manipulating other people. She is, like, if Kaikeyi was my friend and was doing this to me, I'd be very angry. But she sort of thinks that the end justifies the means and is fine with it. And so that's like a really interesting element of her story, where she's doing something that if anybody else knew, I think they would be pretty angry. And it's, to me, not as, justifiable. But to her, she's like, I found this magic and it's fine for me to use it. So I think that's it adds a little bit of tension to the book, because when she finds out that another character is using a similar power, she herself is immediately like, this is awful. This is crossing the line. How dare you manipulate others? And she never really looks in the mirror to think like, I'm doing the same thing. And I think that was one of the challenges of writing from Kaikeyi's perspective, because, in my mind, I was like, this is gross. Like, I don't feel good about what she's doing, but I feel like her character would do this anyways. But she never really gets that moment of self-reflection in the story, because she ends the story still thinking that what she did was fine.
And the language, I loved, the words were delightful. And some of, there's this that jumped out at me. Dasharat's troops parted for me like ghee on a warm summer day. I kept coming back to that. I mean, do you like ghee?
Oh my gosh, like my favorite stories were Krishna stories, because he just eats butter straight up. And like that, if that could be me every day, that would be me. Butter and ghee, favorite.
Would is there a retelling of the Mahabharata, maybe from Draupadi's perspective in your mind?
So I've actually been playing around with a kind of Mahabharata retelling that's from Ganga's perspective. So I have to say kind of, because her story is a very small part of a much, much broader war. But I'm like currently working on it, and I definitely have a lot of Krishna, because he's my favorite. He also has his quirks, but I love him so much. I used to be a Kathak dancer, and I would like fight all the other girls to play Krishna in every song. So I have like a personal stake in this one.
It's wonderful. Yes. And it's the playful it's the playful space to look at all these characters who are gods, who are worshipped, and at the same time go, wait a minute, what you did, was that really acceptable? Was that dharma, or maybe not? And to explore that, and you've done that. You've given voices to women in that narrative, but you've also, for men and women. I'd love for my kid, my boy, to read your version when he grows up, because oh gosh, he's got to look at it from a feminist perspective, because the days were, that was a time when the women were invisible, and the only visible women were villains.
Mm-hmm. You have mostly the villains, and like Kaikeyi, Shurpanka, who's also an extremely vilified woman.
Very nuanced character, yes.
Yeah, and you also have Sita, who I think, if I had an extra 50 pages, which it was kind of getting to be too big, but I would have loved to write more Sita scenes and put in more Sita scenes. And actually, I have some, because they're like, I wrote them and then had to remove them, because she is sort of the one big female character in the Ramayana who's not a villain, and who does have, the similar suffering strength, but she is unbelievably strong and sure of herself. I think one of the qualities I appreciate most about her is that by the end of the story, she's very sure of herself, and she's like, I will go raise my children in the forest. I will ask the earth to swallow me. Like, I know who I am, and I know my worth. And I think because she's only in a couple of scenes with Kaikeyi that are very fraught for other reasons, that doesn't get to come across as much in this story, which I kind of made my peace with, because it's Kaikeyi's story. But I think she's the one who like gets the one woman who gets the least airtime, who I would have loved to get some of those scenes where you see that strength. And again, I think that it's one of those situations where it's like she gets to show this very admirable strength because all the men in her life fail her in some way. And I don't think that that's okay. And I don't think that, that's something that societally I like or want to condone, but she does provide some amount of model of like confidence in oneself and one's virtues in the actual Ramayana that I think is really beautiful.
Right. And the female friendships are incredible between the three wives.
Thanks. That was my like one of my favorite parts to write, because I mean, I think it never even occurred to me really to make them enemies or to make them sort of petty or fighting each other, because I think they would be friends, and they, you know, female friendship is so important in my life, and my female friends are like, they keep me going. And so being able to show those strengths and how you know, every wife has their different strengths and weaknesses, but they all come together and support each other, was just so much fun to write. And it's so much more fun to write women being friends to me than women being enemies. I mean, I'll do both, but writing those friendship scenes is just really rewarding.
What did your mother and grandmother have to say by the revision with both of them having these divergent views about Kaikeyi?
Yeah, so my mom really loved it. And so did my grandma. She actually ended up being like, I finally see your mom's point of view. So she kind of
Wonderful.
came around like 15, 20 years later on this topic, which I thought was pretty funny. But, you know, I was kind of nervous because while they both raised me in a very like feminist and progressive manner, they're also both, you know, extremely religious, and this is playing around with an important religious story. And so I was like so happy that they genuinely liked it and were genuinely happy with it. And my grandma in particular is every time in an interview, like I say, like it happened because my grandma told me these stories, she like tries to get a clipping or like print it out to have it. So I think it's like really cute, but she's really thrilled. It's, you know, she told me so many stories growing up for years and years that it made me really emotional to be able to tell her a story at long last.
It's beautiful. I mean, the stories within your book. You bring in so many characters, so many different aspects of the mythology, so many layers. You know, Saraswati, the river story, and the imagery, the words, the metaphors. It's a delightful read. It's provocative
Thank
for
you.
sure. You know, like I said, it's a living religion, so it must have been hard. You know, to perhaps did you have challenges? You know, how far to take this in terms of your divergence from the original male narrative.
Yeah, so I mean, was like some amount of nervous, but I kind of decided that I was going to tell the story that I wanted to tell, and as long as it was saying what I wanted it to say, then I was going to, you know, be comfortable and try not to really overthink it. But I was nervous about the reception because it is a living religion, and even though it's my religion and I'm a part of it, and I love the original Ramayana story, you know, some people were bound to be upset about it in many ways. And that has happened, but there have also been many, many Hindu people who have reached out to me and said, you know, I loved this book. I loved hearing this other side of the story or reimagining it in this way. And I think that has outweighed the people who have tried to find me to tell me that they don't like it. And so to me, that kind of means that I did my job as best I could. And I mean, I think there have been, you know, as a debut novelist, I'm sure that I've gotten some things wrong, or like things that I thought I portrayed or I wanted to portray did not come through as obviously, or etc. And you know, you have to sort of just accept at some point that the book you're putting out is the book you're putting out, and hope that the next book will be better. But I'm still, you know, I'm personally very much satisfied with where this book ended up, and to me, that's the best I can ask for.
And even within this theme of heartbreak, you know, the serious themes of separation and betrayal, um, there are moments of playfulness and even absurdity, you know, where, you know, absurdity involving a pair of shoes, which I will not go into right now. Again, it's the plot, but the absurdity over the pair of shoes and the treatment the shoes received. It was delightful.
Oh, thank you.
Like that.
I mean, that's how these epics feel to listen to. Sometimes you're like, the shoes, really? But that's what the story is. And so even though it's a completely different version, I wanted to give some of those moments to the story still.
Yeah, I mean, here we are. I mean, this was 500, 200 BCE, and here we are today. Certainly in 2022, the shoes episode is super weird.
Yeah.
Mildly put. So the next project. So then what else is, what are you on to next? So this is, I'm delighted to hear, as I can see from a comment or two, that there's a Mahabharata from Ganga's perspective. So Roma says, very excited for potential Mahabharata retelling from a feminist perspective. And then what else is on? So you were graduated. So what's next for you in terms of your profession?
Yeah, so I just graduated law school, so hopefully going to pass the bar in a couple months and then be a lawyer. So I really love civil rights law. I do primarily reproductive justice and voting rights, so two very fraught topics on which a lot is going on at the moment. So I'm going to be working at a small law firm that does a lot of work in both the gender and election space, which I'm really thrilled about. And then in terms of writing, I mean, I am working on a Mahabharata retelling involving Ganga, hopefully Krishna, Shiva, Amba, all of those characters. So I'm really, it's still in the works because writing a book too and writing from a river's perspective is a new challenge for me. I'm also playing around with a potential alternate history that's more in a recent colonial period, but that's very much like in the beginning stages. I just know that I want to keep writing and I want to keep doing law. And so for as long as I can manage to do both, I'm going to be doing both.
That's wonderful. And in civil rights, reproductive rights, well, the women in the Ramayana, in your story, and in the original version, did not have a right to their bodies. They were summoned by the state, by their monarch, the king, and asked to provide sons. And they did not have rights over their bodies. And we continue to see that argument play out in our times as well. So you're going to be kind of going back and forth, fiction and real life.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a surreal experience launching Kaikeyi at this particular time, considering where we are in the US right now. I actually saw a question in the Ask a Question section that was asking, how will this book play in India? Isn't it more misogynistic? And, I think the answer is it's not, absolutely no. And I get this question a lot. So this is not personal to you, the asker, but I'm writing about a society 3,000 years ago, and all societies 3,000 years ago, or, big societies that were of this size, had similar problems. And I mean, today I'll say that these societies also have similar problems. We're living in a world in the US where we're backsliding 50, 60 years in terms of women's rights. And to say that the problem is worse in India is just, I think that's how it's portrayed in the Western media because it makes us feel better about ourselves to think that other countries are worse than us at this, but they're not. I mean, they're all struggling with misogyny and they're all struggling with these topics. And if I have a concern about the book in India, it's more that it's the religion of many people in that country, and perhaps they're not going to be happy with some religious portrayals, but I'm not concerned that it's a more or less misogynistic society than America because, in my day job, I work every day in the religious inspired misogyny of the US, and I see firsthand how terrible that is. And so there are a lot of parallels between, human created religious misogyny, because I really do think that it's attributable to how humans have chosen to build these institutions in across all religions. I think pretty much all the major religions have these problems, and you see that today with, you know, the abortion conversation in the US, which is very much religiously motivated and very much, you know, a majority religion putting certain or prioritizing their beliefs or using their belief system to create laws in a way that's harmful to women. And I think you see that in all societies, but I don't think it's a particular problem in India and not elsewhere. So I'm as worried about the misogyny in India as I am worried about the misogyny in the US, which is to say somewhat, but there's plenty of very progressive feminist voices in both those countries. Sorry, I wanted to loop that question in, so I end up giving a broader answer, but.
I'm glad you did, and I couldn't agree more with you. Again, it's a portrayal. We do tend to, in Western media coverage, look with a very myopic lens at the East. You know, the coverage is mostly poverty, and it's misogyny. You know, that would be like, you know, portraying the worst elements, you know, in Western society. Every society has its challenges, and because, you know, we straddle two cultures, you know, straddle two continents, you can see the perspective. You got a very clear perspective on both sides, and even among, you know, in a current society, you know, I did talk about my mother trying to hold me back. You know, me being a woman, you know, with these very ancient beliefs of, you know, how a woman should be. But even in my family, in my contemporaries, I mean, I was never stopped from being a journalist. I have family members, you know, who are lawyers, you know, doctors, you know, scientists, and, you know, in my mother's generation, and possibly her mother's generation, you know, it's like what Indra Nooyi said. We had her on Where We Live, and she writes in her book, the former PepsiCo chairman. You know, the mothers, you know, kind of accelerate and break. You know, they want for their daughters what they did not have, but at the same time are so conscious of how society would judge them. So they would kind of accelerate a bit and let the daughter go a bit, and then break right away, you know, going, wait a minute, you know, you're educated, but don't forget your role as a wife and a mother. So so that's one part of it. But India has had, you know, women prime minister. India has had women Supreme Court judges. India has had, you know, India continues to have women scientists and CEOs, and yes.
Yeah. And I think, you know, every society has, or every religion has some group that teaches modesty values, you know. And I grew up in the American Midwest. Like, I've seen this in churches firsthand, what some of my friends went through. It might not take the form of taking the names of these particular Hindu women, but we all have it. I mean, growing up, had the fingertip rule and the finger length rule for my tank top straps, like in schools. You know, we have it everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, you're right, battling misogyny here and there, and you know, thankful for the open voices and the retelling versions everywhere too.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions? The Mahabharata retelling would be amazing. Oh my God, it's from Ashwini. I would love to be there to be a sequel of Kaikeyi, Leslie. Sequel, so Kaikeyi can come to a self-realization, and we can see the war plus aftermath. See, you have.
I mean, I would never say never to that. There have been points in Kaikeyi's journey where I was like, maybe this should be 2 books, the war. So I have some other projects that I want to do, but I would never say never to revisiting this story, especially because I do think that Kaikeyi has a lot of character growth, and that potential to achieve that character growth, both in the Ramayana itself and in her story, would come during and after the war. So never say never. I see a question in the chat box that I found it fascinating that Kaushalya was on Kaikeyi's side immediately instead of having to come around like every other character, and it seems a very conscious choice. Could you elaborate on the importance of Kaushalya's decision on Kaikeyi's narrative? Yeah, so I think that Kaushalya she was one of my favorite characters to write, and I think that came through because I just adore her. But Kaushalya is both very different to and very similar to Kaikeyi, and that they're both very strong-willed and they both are very powerful, but they wield it in different ways. And early on, that leads them to some amount of tension or conflict. But as time goes on, they realize that they're amazing allies. And to me, having Kaushalya stay on Kaikeyi's side was a choice that I made for a few reasons. First, I think that, Ram kind of assumes that Kaushalya is going to be on his side because she's his birth mother and she loves him very much, and all of those things are true. But I think because of that, he doesn't spend as much time trying to convince her as he does everybody else. And so you see that Kaushalya remains unconvinced, and so she remains sort of primed to agree to listen to Kaikeyi, who she also has a very strong familial, trusting bond with. And I think that's part of it. And I think the other part of it is that she, I think that Kaushalya, more than any other character in the book, sees people very clearly for who they are. And it's subtle, but she sees Sumitra and she wants to protect her. And you see that early on. She sees Kaikeyi, and it doesn't come across in Kaikeyi's favor in the beginning, but she wins her over. She sort of can really see what's going on. And I think that's her, big strength. And that means that she sees that she wants Ram to be king, but not right that minute. And so she's also in that way, because of who she is and her insights, primed to feel that way. I'm a Kaushalya stan too. Good. Kaushalya stans unite. She's the best person in the book.
Well, this is delightful. And Mallory, oh wow, you have Sunny. Yes, we stand Kaushalya. Mallory, would you like to moderate the Q&A, or do I keep going?
I'm here.
Hey.
Sure,
Sorry, I had sort of started taking over the Q&A.
No, that's perfect. I have to say, this is one of the best chats we've ever had. People love you in your book, and I hope later you rewatch it so that you can read everything going on in the chat, because you have some amazing fans. So jumping in, we'll do a few questions, if that's okay, if we go a little bit over in time.
For sure.
So here it says, hi, as someone who grew up on the Valmiki Ramayana, I was surprised at Kaikeyi's full absolution. I was expecting a morally gray Kaikeyi, not a Kaikeyi who acted entirely within circumstance. Was it a conscious choice to absolve her, or is the reader expected to interpret her actions through the lens of an unreliable narrator, see her as morally gray regardless? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I got to this a little bit, so I'll keep it short. Yeah. But I think that, to me, Kaikeyi is a morally great character who is sort of, because she's telling her story, she's justifying every single thing that she does. And I think that, especially her manipulativeness, as well as her sort of belief that she can unilaterally make decisions for everybody, are sort of her big flaws. And you see that creating problems for her, especially the second part, where her sons are not going along with her unilateral decisions, or she is sort of assuming the worst of people because she's decided that this is how things are. And so I want her to be a sympathetic character, but I also did want her to be, a character where you're going like, yikes, at some of the things that she's doing. But because you're in her head, she's not the kind of character, at least in this story, to ever think that her manipulations or her decisions were wrong. Like she might be upset about where she ended up and think that she doesn't deserve what happened to her, or be depressed about her circumstances, but she definitely believes that she made all the right choices.
Perfect. Well, thank you for talking about that a little bit more. So the next one, can you please recommend a book for newcomers to Indian Hindu mythology? And as a follow-up, we say also any that are specifically highlighting female relationships and perspectives.
Yeah, so two that I love, and there's it's one Rama and one Mahabharat, is Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's Palace of Illusions, which is the Mahabharat from Draupadi's perspective, and Forest of Enchantments, which is the Ramayana from Sita's perspective. And both are, I'd say they stick much closer to the original epic than Kaikeyi. So if you're looking for more like what happened in these epics, but told through the lens of a female perspective, I think those are really good. And just, she's such a beautiful writer. So those are really, really great starting points for the two biggest Indian epics.
Perfect. So everyone has to go check those out as well. So next question, not Kaikeyi specific, but what is the cause of the new wave of feminist narration mythology in literature? And do you see more of these coming for Hindu mythology?
Yeah, so I think there's like potentially a market answer and a social answer. And the market answer is that Cersei did incredibly well. And people who wanted to tell these stories, I think, were like, wow, it's finally our time. We can succeed in this market. I think the social connection is also that in the past 5 years, not just past 5 years, but recently there's been a, increasing trend towards thinking about how narratives have been spun against women. Like I think about the Free Britney movement and how we're all sort of rethinking what we were thinking in the 2000s. I mean, I was a child, so I didn't have an opinion, but I see a lot of that on the internet. And so I think that there's just this current like movement to question those narratives in media. And that's, what we saw in the Me Too movement, a lot of reclaiming narratives or reframing what we had previously thought of as okay or accepted, or just like that's how society is. And so I think that primed us to also think about these more foundational stories. And it's my hope that, we've seen a lot for Greek mythology, and we've seen several for more broadly European mythologies. And I just really want to see that for Hindu mythology, but also for mythology across pretty much everywhere that's not European mythology. I want to see those get equal spotlight and airtime, because I think they're so interesting and there's so much to be said. And so I'm really hopeful that that's what's next in this trend.
Yeah, who doesn't love good mythology?
Exactly.
Any and all kinds of mythology. I just love to read. So this is an interesting question more about your writing process. But how did you juggle going to law school and writing a book? Did you do it at the same time? What was your method of getting this done?
Yeah, so I did it at the same time. I drafted Kaikeyi in the first semester of law school, and then went through the publishing journey and got it published in my last semester of law school. I'm not sure I strictly recommend that, but it was great. I mean, it was like I've talked about, a lot of what I was doing in the law side and in internships and in part-time jobs was very similar to what I was thinking about and writing about thematically in Kaikeyi. So there was a lot of synergy and a lot of writing in both, and so it was really great in that way. I definitely slept less than I probably should have, but to me it was worth it. And I feel very lucky that I got to do both, and I think it's really a privileged thing to be able to do both. So I'm very grateful for the fact that I had such supportive friends and family who sort of enabled me to be able to do both.
Well, just both amazing accomplishments. So congratulations to you, because that is very impressive. So I'm going to ask one or two more questions before we wrap up. This one is a statement first. I just finished Kaikeyi a couple days ago and loved it. It would be wonderful to see this turned into a movie or a series. They did ask about your next book project, which you already talked about. But what are your thoughts about potentially seeing this turned into movie or television, something along those lines?
Yeah, so I mean, I would love to see Kaikeyi as a movie or a limited series. I feel like it would lend itself well to a short limited series, especially since it's already split up in parts. And I mostly say that also because I would love to see more just South Asian characters on screen, and a story that's, I mean, you got this in Bollywood and in South Asian film, so I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but especially in a Western audience, to get all South Asian cast would be amazing. So yeah, I mean, I would love it. It's not really up to me, but you know, again, never say never. Maybe one day it'll happen.
Well, fingers crossed, because I think all of us would be very excited to see that brought to the screen in any way. But with that being said, I'm going to wrap up. Someone did ask about if the book will be signed. Yes. So there will be a link in the chat, and you can order your copy from the Mark Twain Museum store, and it will be a signed copy. So for anyone curious about that. So I want to thank both of you so much for a wonderful evening. If you have not already read and purchased your copy, go look in the chat. We'll put the link there, and make sure you go and buy it. It is amazing. So please go and make sure you get a copy of this. Thank you both so much. This was wonderful. And just to wrap up, and as a reminder, if you missed part of the program or you want to go back and rewatch some of it, you are able to do so. So you can go back at the end and rewatch everything. It will be posted on our website if you want to go and watch it again that way a little bit later. You can also go on our events page and check out any of our upcoming events that are going to be happening soon, whether virtual or in person. And if you plan on joining us for more virtual programming in the future, please be aware that we will be moving programming off of Crowdcast, which we have been using, and into Zoom webinar in response to the feedback we've received from people like you. So nothing about the registration process will change, but you will receive confirmation and reminder emails with a Zoom link instead of a Crowdcast link. So just a note about that moving forward. So that is it. That's all I have for tonight. Thank you again to both of our speakers for talking about this amazing book. Make sure you go and get your copy. Thank you for joining us, and everyone have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you all. And thank you so much, Sujata. This is
what a pleasure. Have a great evening.
Thank you.